Let me bring in my guest, Mr. Paul Alaje. Dr. Paul Alaje is the chief economist at SPM Professionals. He joins us virtually from Ibadan, the Oyo State capital. Dr. Alaje, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so very much for having me. A beautiful evening to you, sir.
Fantastic. Before I bring you on, let me just run through a few things for our audience so they get to see, for those who may have missed out. Then you can make your initial comment as to what you make of this appropriation bill. But I know generally it's about 70% higher than the previous. So you can see there the 2026 appropriation bill, that's a spending limit, 58 trillion, revenue target of 34. So you can see the deficit there, 23 trillion. Well, we're going to be spending about 15 trillion in debt servicing. Capital component is 26 and 15 trillion is for recurrent expenditure. So if we go to some of the assumptions, you can see GDP growth based on the medium-term framework. You can see it's about 4.68. Crude oil price projected now a bit more conservative from previous 75 to 65. And then it was initially over 1,500 in terms of the exchange rate. Maybe they have some information we don't have. Now they're saying it's going to stay at 1.4. Inflation is 14% as we speak, and their target is going to moderate around 16% next year. 1.8 million barrels per year. Look at the priority sectors, Dr. Alaje. We can see that defense and security has gone up. It was 4.9, now it's 5.4. Infrastructure went down slightly. Health stays the same, education stays the same. So these are just some of the, but we'll come to this just a moment. But Dr. Paul, if you see this, I'm going to ask you these questions later of what the assumptions were in 2025, which is not concluded as to their recent performance. But generally speaking, how do you describe this budget? Is it conservative? Is it ambitious? Or is it just resilient? What word comes to your mind when you saw this budget?
Okay, thank you so very much for before the end of the year. I think first that is commendable. One would think that it's important for us to always ensure that this budget is presented as of September so that by December it is passed into law. But we can see when this budget is presented, after this, the National Assembly will look at it individually. There will be committee invitation from different ministry, agencies, and parastatals of government. Then the joint session of National Assembly will sit before the budget is adopted, and it will be recommended for the president. Of course, an executive bill, it will be passed into law. So first of all, we must say that yes, although it came really late because it should have been presented by September, October, but it's also good that we have it presented in December. There were years where budgets were even presented after within the year, which of course is not a place we should find ourselves at any time. The numbers are very interesting numbers. The president is looking at 58 trillion naira as his planned expenditure for 2026. We also noticed that the president has mentioned that he has projected revenue of 34.33, which means there will be debts, there will be a gap for debts, because whatever we cannot fill in, we are looking at about 23.85 trillion naira. Which is quite it's significant. That's about 44.28% of our GDP. That's what the president is looking at. And if you look at it again, as you have displayed it on your screen, the capital component of that budget is 26.08 out of the entire 58 trillion naira that we are expecting. But I need to now zoom in on the debt service. Debt service, if you look at it, if you can go back to debt service so that our audience that are listening can look at it very carefully. The debt service is okay, so I'll just use what I have here. The projected debt service that government is looking to spend for this year is it's nearly 50% of the entire revenue. And if you look up by 2025, the 2025 budget, government was expecting to have certain revenue, but when you look at what we have done based on the president's report, we have only done about 51% or less than 60%, if you like, of that revenue projection if you prorate it for 3 quarters, Q1, Q2, and Q3. So if you go by that for 2026, knowing fully well that the chances of meeting 100% revenue that is projected is really very narrow. Yes, FRS will do the best. By that time, we might be looking at a new nomenclature, National Revenue Service, and we know that immigration, custom, all of them will do the best. But if we go the way we have gone in the last 10 years, the pattern of not meeting up with our revenue targets, what does that mean? What it means is that if we must spend our capital expenditure, because recurrent to be spent anyway, our capital expenditure, we need to go borrowing. If you therefore go borrowing, that means government may need to also seek approval from the National Assembly. When that happens, to borrow more money beyond what you have estimated in the budget, that means our cost of debt, the debt we will take, may be more than 23 trillion naira. Another thing of interest here may be what we have as debt service, 15.52 trillion naira. If we don't meet the revenue targets, remember that before the administration came on board, the debt service to revenue was 98%. The administration managed to push it down to 70% of revenue. Now, if we don't meet these revenue targets, the less of revenue we make, the more of debt service. If you go by projection, you might be looking at over 80% revenue to debt service. Now, the real challenge Nigeria has is how do we correct what is recommended? Of course, which is 33.3%. Now, to what we are seeing, 70, it even used to be 98%. What must we do to correct this, as we have seen it, as government has presented its budget, and chances of meeting up is really very narrow?
So would you say that, so let's look at some of the assumptions. I'm happy the producer is going to put it up in just a moment. So let me go to my system. Just perusing through some of the assumption. In fact, maybe let's go back to 2025 and get to see, I want to run through 2024 and see what played out, 2025, and see what has played out so far. If we get to this 2026, guys, if we can get back to 2025 budget assumptions, so we'll do a comparison or how far we've come in terms of the budget. You can see that in 2025 budget, which is not this one, we had our GDP growth, okay, that's what I'm looking for, guys. Thank you. So you can see deliberately put the reds in where we have not met up. So crude oil price, we estimated 2.6. We're roving around 1.4, 1.5 without condensate. This is just crude oil. If you look at the GDP growth rate, we're looking at 3.7 as we speak. If you prorate the annualized number based on the rebased GDP, if you go down to the exchange rate, we've done pretty well. We've maintained and strengthened. So that's why it's in blue. You go to the oil price. We're doing about $60 per barrel for Brent. I think WTI is about 50-something. So you can see in $15 deficit. And then we're also done well with the rebased inflation number. So when you look at this particular number and look at what the government has projected in 2026, how realistic are their assumptions?
First of all, I must say I give kudos to the central bank and the government regarding exchange rate. The exchange rate has largely been stabilized around 1,500, 1,550. When you look at the price for Brent crude, I mentioned to your colleague when I was interviewed, when the budget was eventually passed, that it's ambitious, and I doubt if we're able to meet up, both with 2.06 million per barrel a day projection, as well as the price. And when the two happen and we are not able to meet either, it's concerned. But when you are not able to meet both, as you are projected on your screen, as of Q3 that we have experienced and we can speak of, then you know that we head for some much bigger concerns. But yeah, it's inflation. It's inflation. Really the same thing. When the president made presentation of the budget, inflation at that time, we were using the 2009 base year, and this is where the confusion comes from. The inflation you have now is a completely different inflation from the one we had that time. And you see, this is where it's important people get right education. I am not saying inflation is not 14.45%, but I am saying that this inflation you have is on a different base year. If you must compare this with what inflation should be, you won't get less than 28, 29, 30% inflation numbers. But because we have changed the base year, we are now using a much closer base year that makes inflation to a large extent to come down. If not, if we say inflation was 34% in April or March this year, and in November, inflation now dropped to 14%. Please, what can explain that? What can you use to explain that? In the markets, in real estate, in rent, in transport, purchase of pure water, to the rich, the airline ticket, nothing. You can't explain it. What can help us explain those will be, one, improvement in reserve, which accounts for about 6% of the 20% drop. That's what can explain for it. And as the relative stability you have seen. So the real sense here is that we have adopted a new base year. And that is why in economics, we call it outlier. We don't score it. You don't say it's better or worse off. So what inflation will be, it should have been an isolated number because you cannot use it. However, for the remaining parameter, I can tell you that we have seen positive growth, which is commendable, even though it's not up to what the president projected. And we have seen exchange rate, around 1,005, 1,006, even though what was projected was over 1,400. And we still give it to the government because we have seen relative stability. But in the issue of crude, which were a major parameter, we have largely fallen short of this. Perhaps if your producer can help us with 2026 assumptions, I think that would then help us so that those who are viewing us tonight or they will watch us in the future can now see that we are not just quoting numbers.
My apologies. Before, as we begin to wind down, the producer is going to put it up so that you can see and speak to the numbers, the appropriation numbers and the assumptions. But in addition, as you're winding down on this conversation, what is more important to Nigerians? You and I can be talking these numbers and analyzing. Nigerians just want a better life. Can this budget give Nigerians a better life in 2026? In addition to your submission in 2 minutes.
Okay, so I will just speak to the number that I will rank up on that. So for the budget, 58.18 trillion, that's what the president is assuming. But I think this number may be adjusted by the Assembly as the practice has been. The growth rate of 4.68% is not unachievable. I believe it's achievable. The price is moderate, but I think Assembly may also want to increase it for some reasons. So those are the things executives should be prepared for. 16% inflation, it may be slightly above because from April next year or May next year, you will start seeing what the real inflation number will be. Ask me why. The reason is because you will now be comparing the same base year together. We are comparing a previous base year with an entirely different base year. Normally in econometrics, you should have scored them as null, or they would have given you outliers number, a major jump, which of course we know how to realign that so that the numbers can agree. The 1.8 barrels, I think it's a little bit high, though it's not as high as we have, so it's a little bit higher than what is expected. For exchange rate, if Dangote refinery can push, and this is where the conversation we need to set ourselves the truth, Dangote has helped to largely stabilize the currency because of 50% of our import of PMS and diesel to a large extent have been rescued by that refinery. If we can have Dangote refinery improve its capacity, which he has promised, or number two, if you can have a competitor locally, please. Any competition you are trying to do outside Nigeria is technically destroying our currency. So yes, I believe in competition. I've written for competition. I believe in market system, but market system that wants to now take off our local refineries or refinery that is producing within our soil is never what should be supported by any meaningful, any reasonable Nigerian or economist for that matter. So if you can have that, you can see relative stability. You have seen what Central Bank has done. We have more to cover in terms of import coverage. We have seen that we have been able to do up to 45 trillion naira in coverage. So all of those are there. So now to speak to whether this budget will deliver Nigeria, unfortunately, I don't think it will. Why? Because what we need versus what we have is what we should be looking at. $100 billion is what you need for road infrastructure. For real, we have one of the best hands managing the railway now. But are we going to appropriate what the railway needs? We have seen some concerns in the railway in no time. The management of railway has quickly fixed those problems. Can we devote more money into rail, as I've seen in Gliwice and in Katowice, in Poland? Can we devote more money? Can states agree that they want to put money along those?
All right, Dr. Alaje, I feel quite sad. When you were really, the very meat of the matter, which is how it affects Nigerians and all of us. We can talk about these numbers as much as we want. What Nigerians want is how they can afford just basic life every other day. But that's how much we can take from you. Unfortunately, the network wouldn't allow us to hear you clearly. But we must thank you so much. It's an ongoing conversation. We hope that maybe by a miracle can have some kind of an upside risk to sway the headwinds we're experiencing. Maybe that will tilt things in our direction. But Dr. Paul Alaje is the chief economist at SPM Professionals, joining us from Ibadan, the Oyo State capital.